Ever get that feeling like when you're totally engrossed in a movie or a book or even just listening to a song, that it's doing something more than just entertaining you? Like it's making you think about big stuff, about life and meaning, about what beauty is, even about right and wrong. It's almost like the artist is a philosopher in disguise.
Oh, absolutely. It's a powerful feeling. It makes you realize that art can really grapple with these deep questions, not just in a theoretical way, but in a way that you actually feel and experience. It makes you wonder if we can explore these philosophical sides of art, not just through abstract thought, but by actually looking at how people experience it and understand it.
Yeah, exactly. That's what we're diving into today. You sent us a huge amount of info on the experimental philosophy of art and aesthetics. And we're going to explore how using scientific methods can help us understand those classic philosophical questions about art. It's like bringing science to the art party.
Right. The main idea is to take those age-old philosophical questions. What is art, really? Does a work of art actually exist? Are our ideas about beauty just personal, or is there something more universal?
Yeah.
And look at them using actual research and data. It's going beyond just thinking about these things in our heads and actually seeing what real-world insights we can gather.
So this kind of puts in the conversation with, well, with empirical aesthetics, right?
hmm
Which is, I guess, kind of like the psychology of how we experience art.
Yeah, that's a great point and a really important distinction. Think of it this way. Empirical aesthetics, or the psychology of art, has traditionally focused on the how of our experience with art, the emotions we feel, the sensory details we notice, the things happening in our brains when we encounter art. It's asking questions like, how does art make us feel these things? What are the common threads in how different people respond?
So it's basically the science of our art experience.
Exactly. Now, experimental philosophy of art and aesthetics, though it's definitely drawing on these psychological findings, it's actually more interested in those big conceptual questions that philosophers have been debating for centuries. It's not about what happens in our brains when we see a painting, but more about things like, do people actually think that if a character in a story is a jerk, the artwork itself is less beautiful? Like, do we actually believe those two things are connected? Or do people think something has to be beautiful to be considered art? So it's about using these research methods to understand our basic ideas about art, beauty, and even morality, how those things all connect.
So for today's deep dive, what we're trying to do is to bring you some of the most mind-blowing findings from this experimental approach. We want to see how those philosophical questions about art are being explored in a really concrete way. We're hoping to give you some aha moments without getting too bogged down in all the jargon and academic language.
That's exactly it. And to give you a bit of context, this whole idea of blending philosophy with scientific methods in the study of art actually has a history. It's not brand new.
Okay, so let's go back in time then. What's the origin story of this approach?
Well, you can trace some of the early roots back to 19th century Germany with a guy named Gustav Fechner. He was a pioneer in experimental psychology, and he was one of the first to apply these new scientific methods to the study of aesthetics, what he called bottom-up aesthetics. He did studies where he'd show people simple things, like rectangles with different proportions or different arrangements of lines, and he'd ask them about their preferences. He was trying to find some kind of basic laws of taste by looking at those simple visual
It's
elements.
like he's trying to break down aesthetics into its basic building blocks.
Exactly. Then, moving on to the mid-20th century, you have Thomas Monroe, who was an art historian and philosopher. He was a big advocate for bringing together philosophical and scientific approaches in aesthetics. He said that philosophers had been asking questions for a long time that actually had an empirical component apart that could be studied through observation and experiment.
Do you have any examples of the kind of questions he was talking about?
Sure. He highlighted questions like, how do artists actually go about the process of creation? What kind of impact does art have on us, the audience, when we experience it? Are there any rules or principles that make art effective, whether it's about giving us pleasure or teaching us something? Are there some works of art that seem to appeal to everyone, regardless of culture or time period? And how do we even classify the different types of aesthetic pleasure that we experience? Monroe felt that if philosophers were asking these sorts of questions, they should be open to using empirical methods to find answers.
It does seem like a pretty logical next step, but why didn't this whole integrated approach take off right away? Was there something holding it back?
Well, not everyone was as enthusiastic as Monroe about this. One skeptic was George Dickey, who had some serious doubts about how useful psychology could actually be for understanding aesthetics. He had a couple of main objections. One was that a lot of the psychological studies at the time used very simplified stimuli, like those geometric shapes that Fechner was using. They weren't looking at real, complex works of art. Dickey argued that studying preferences for rectangles wasn't going to tell us much about how we appreciate, say, a Renaissance painting.
Yeah, I can see that. It's a pretty big leap in complexity.
His other concern was more fundamental. He believed that philosophy and science were fundamentally different types of inquiry, with different goals and methods. Philosophical problems, whether in ethics or the philosophy of science, weren't going to be solved by doing scientific studies. And he felt the same way about aesthetics. For him, aesthetics was mainly about analyzing the concepts and language we use when we talk about and judge art.
So, almost like a turf war between philosophy and science.
Yeah, in a way, and for a while this skeptical view was pretty dominant. But then, starting in the late 1980s, things started to change. Philosophers of art began to increasingly draw upon research in cognitive science and, to some extent, empirical aesthetics. And then, around 2010, you start to see philosophers actually designing and conducting their own empirical studies to tackle these questions.
Which brings us to the modern version of this approach, experimental philosophy of art and aesthetics. And we mentioned earlier that while there's definitely overlap with empirical aesthetics, there's also a key difference. Could you remind our listeners of that distinction?
Absolutely. The way to think about it is this. Empirical aesthetics, or the psychology of art, is primarily investigating the psychological responses we have to art, the what and the how of our reactions. What emotions do we feel when we look at a painting or listen to music? What aspects of the artwork capture our attention? Are there individual differences in those responses? It's about the subjective experience of art.
So it's about the experience itself, not the concept.
Exactly. Experimental philosophy of art and aesthetics, however, uses empirical methods, like experiments and surveys, to probe those underlying conceptual frameworks that we have about art. It's asking questions like, what do people think about this? What are their basic assumptions about art? For example, do we as a culture conceptually separate the aesthetic flaws of an artwork from its moral flaws? Like, can a painting be beautiful but still depict something morally wrong? Or, what are the fundamental criteria that we use, just as ordinary people, to decide whether something is art or not? It's about using those empirical methods, those research tools, to explore our understanding of those core concepts.
So for this deep dive, our goal is to unpack some of the most interesting and thought-provoking findings from this experimental approach. We want to see how they're tackling these philosophical questions about art by actually going out and seeing what people think. It's about looking for those moments where you go, oh, I never thought about it like that.
Exactly. And a great place to start is with one of the most fundamental questions in philosophy of art. What is art? Experimental philosophy has definitely taken on that question head on.
It seems like it. Philosophers have spent centuries debating the definition of art, focusing on things like what things actually count as art. Are there specific things that something must have to be considered art? And what is the purpose of calling something art? Is it a way of saying it's good or just a way of classifying it? A lot of people believe a good definition of art should reflect how people actually engage with it, so it makes sense that experimental philosophy would explore this.
So what have these empirical studies shown about how people actually understand what art is?
One of the early researchers in this area was Richard Camber. He presented people with descriptions and images of different objects, including those tricky edge cases that philosophers love to debate things that might not be aesthetically pleasing at all, or things that were created before formal art institutions even existed. He asked people if they would classify these things as art. Essentially, he was testing how well different philosophical definitions lined up with people's intuition. He looked at aesthetic definitions that art is meant to be aesthetically appreciated, institutional definitions that art is art because the art world says it is, and historical definitions that something becomes art because it's part of a historical tradition of artworks.
Interesting. So did he find one of those definitions that really matched how people think?
Not really. No clear winner. He concluded that none of the theories perfectly captured how people judged all the different examples. He did find, though, that the aesthetic definition, the idea that art is intentionally created to give people an aesthetic experience, seemed to line up a bit better with people's intuitions than the other definitions. He did another study where he asked people to explain why they classified something as art, and they most often pointed to the creator's intention.
But it wasn't like a slam dunk for the aesthetic definition.
Not quite. And Camber's work has been challenged, too. Another researcher, Annelise Montserrat, agrees that we shouldn't just rely on philosophers' personal intuitions about what art is, but she questioned whether directly asking regular people was the best way to define it either. Maybe, she suggested, those everyday intuitions should play a less direct role, like helping us understand how the concept of art actually works in practice, rather than directly telling us what the definition should be. Another researcher, Ellen Winter, also pointed out that Camber's study was sort of preliminary. He tested a lot of different theories, but only used a small number of examples, and suggested that maybe using a more nuanced scale than just yes or no would give more helpful results.
So it sounds like finding a clear, universally accepted definition of art is a lot trickier than it seems, even when you use empirical methods. It highlights that how we understand art in everyday life is flexible and relies more on the intention behind the work than any strict rules.
Yeah, exactly. However, some research has explored the connection between how much we like something and whether we think it's art. Matthew Pulowski and his colleagues found a positive correlation between those two things. The more people reported liking something, whether it was an abstract painting, a super realistic one, or even something they considered poorly made, the more likely they were to call it art. It does make you think that aesthetic appreciation might be a key part of how we think about art. It makes sense to me. I've definitely been more likely to call something art if it really resonated with me in some way.
Yeah, I get that. We might be more likely to give something the label of art if it grabs us somehow, if we find it engaging or enjoyable. Building on this idea of how people decide what's art, there's also the question of whether art needs to meet a specific set of criteria. Can we say that there are necessary and sufficient conditions for something to be considered art? Els Micheloni-Ta and Marcus Neer explored this question. They asked people who weren't art professionals whether they thought things like intentional creation, aesthetic value, and recognition by art institutions were absolutely essential for something to be considered art.
And what did they find out about those essential criteria? Are they really essential?
Interestingly, kind of like what Camber found, they discovered that people's understanding of art isn't really about strict rules. Instead, it works more like what's called a cluster concept. What surprised them was that none of those three things, the intentional creation, the aesthetic value, or the art world recognition, were consistently seen as absolutely necessary by everyone. There were even cases where people thought something could still be art, even if it was created accidentally.
Accidentally created art. That's a bit of a curveball.
Yeah.
It kind of challenges a lot of common assumptions about what makes something art, right?
It does, especially when you consider that lots of philosophers, and other empirical research too, put a lot of emphasis on the artist's intention in defining art. Studies have shown that whether people believe something was meant to be art can really influence whether they see a copy as the same artwork as the original. Generally, we tend to categorize things based on what we think the creator intended. So yeah, this accidental art finding is definitely interesting.
It definitely stands out. Micheloni and Pierre also found that people were more likely to call AI-generated images art than they were to call the AI itself an artist, which might be because we're not really sure how to attribute mental states or intentions to an AI. But even with human creators, their research suggests that people are open to the idea of art happening by accident. It seems like our everyday concept of art is much more flexible than some of those formal definitions might suggest.
Totally. Then there's this other question. Is calling something art just a neutral label, or is there always some kind of judgment attached to it? Sheni Liao, Aaron Meskin, and Joshua Novi wanted to figure this out by looking at how we use language. They argue that the concept of art isn't purely descriptive, just stating a fact, and it's not purely evaluative, like saying it's good or bad.
So how did they use language analysis to figure that out?
They used a linguistic test that looks at how natural sentences sound. The test involves sentences like, "that is not good, but it is true" concept. Their research showed that concepts that are both descriptive and evaluative, what they call dual character concepts, usually sound fine in this structure. Like, that is not a good person, but it is a true friend. Totally makes sense. But purely descriptive concepts sound weird, like, that is not bad weather, but it is a true Tuesday. And purely evaluative concepts sound strange too, like, that is not bad, but it is a true masterpiece.
Okay, I see where you're going with this. So what happened when they used this test with the concept of art?
People thought the sentence, "that is not good, but it is true art," sounded fine. So based on this, Liao, Meskin, and Nobi argued that art is a dual character concept. It has both descriptive and evaluative aspects, but it's not purely positive. It's more complex than just saying this is art means this is good, or just this fits into this specific category.
It's like there are different layers to the concept of art. Now, once we've sort of figured out what art is, Another set of philosophical questions comes up, those about the ontology of art. Basically, what kind of thing is a work of art? How is it created? Can it be destroyed? What does it mean for two pieces of art to be the same?
You got it. Those questions are all about the fundamental nature of art, how it exists. And one important thing to remember is that there's a difference between repeatable and non-repeatable artworks. Repeatable works like musical pieces or plays can have multiple performances. Non-repeatable works like paintings or unique sculptures only exist as one original object and everything else is a copy. This difference is really important for how we think about their identity and value. Let's start with those repeatable artworks, like music. What are some of the big questions there?
One of the big ones is, when are two different performances considered to be performances of the same work? Christopher Bartell looked at this in pop music. He gave people scenarios where musical performances of the same song were different in certain ways. Maybe the performer was different, or the overall feeling was different, or even the lyrics had slightly different meanings. He wanted to know what people considered important when deciding whether it was the same song.
So what did he find? Did people care more about who was performing it, or was there something else?
It's really interesting. Bartell found that who was singing the song didn't really matter much in whether people thought it was the same song or not. What did matter was whether the overall feeling of the performance was different. Like if one performance was super sad and another was upbeat and happy, and whether the implied meaning of the lyrics or the way they were sung was different. It's like the feeling and the overall message of the song were more important for defining its identity than who was actually performing it.
That makes sense. Elza Michelonitou and Villiers Stranseca did some work with classical music, looking at a few different theories about how we decide if two musical works are the same. These theories included sonicism, which says that the identity of a work depends solely on its sound, instrumentalism, which says that the instruments used also matter, and contextualism, which adds historical context to the mix. Unlike Bartell's research, their study was about the identity of two performances that happened at the same time. What did they find out about classical music?
They found that people's intuitions were most in line with pure sonicism, the idea that a musical work's identity depends entirely on its acoustic properties. But they also found that knowing who the composer was did play a role. And unlike what Bartell found with pop music, their study indicated that people generally see classical music as easily repeatable across different performances. So it seems like for classical music, the score and the sound it makes are the most important, rather than the specifics of any particular performance.
It seems that way. Now, Nemesio Puer raised an interesting point about the methods used in this research. He argued that just using written descriptions of music might not fully capture how we actually think about musical identity. He suggested that you really need to actually hear the music to properly understand these questions. And when he did his own experiments where people actually listened to music, he found that people were even more likely to judge identity based on the sound alone. So hearing is believing, I guess.
It appears so. And Michelonitou and Stranseca also explored what it means for a musical work to persist over time. What makes a version of the work from, say, 100 years ago still the same work as a version from today? They looked at the idea that the composer's original purpose might be really important for a work's identity over time, but once again they found that people tended to focus on the sound. So it seems that the melody is what matters most, even if it's played differently later on.
Yeah, that's pretty consistent. And there's a fascinating twist. Michelonitou and Clément Canon found that our judgments about whether two artworks are the same, both in music and visual art, can be influenced by our values what we think is good or bad. They found some evidence for what's called the Phineas Gage effect, which is the idea that changes in qualities that we value can change our judgment of whether something is still the same thing. If a musical piece was changed in a way that made people think it was better, they were more likely to say it was still the same work. But if the physical materials were changed, or if the work was seen as morally worse, that overrode the effect. So it's possible that our sense of what makes something the same is influenced by whether we think it got better or worse.
That's really interesting. Now, switching to non-repeatable works, like paintings, the difference between an original and a copy seems really crucial, right?
Absolutely. Because these kinds of artworks exist as single, unique objects, the question of copies raises big questions about identity and value. Research that compares how we think about everyday objects and artworks is pretty insightful here. Studies show that with regular objects like, say, a chair, The exact physical material isn't always the most important thing in whether we think it's the same chair after it's been repaired.
So if I replace a part in my car, it doesn't suddenly become a different car to me.
Right. But with art, studies show that even an exact copy isn't generally considered the same artwork as the original.
Even if you literally can't tell the difference by looking at them.
Yeah, even then. And the research clearly shows that people put a much higher value on the original than on the copy, even if they look identical. George Newman has done a lot of work exploring why this is. One major factor seems to be the idea that the original work is the product of a unique act of creation. Another is this idea of physical contact between the artwork and the original artist. People seem to believe that something of the artist is transferred to the artwork through that contact. It's almost like a religious relic that's believed to have been touched by a saint.
That's a great comparison. It's fascinating. It's not even just about literal touch. The intention of contact seems to be important too. Shenya Liao, Aaron Meskin, and Jade Fletcher did a study on what they call the contagion effect in museums. They found that believing that museum objects had been near the artist or even touched by them significantly affected how much people valued them aesthetically, especially if they thought those objects were unique. This uniqueness factor was a bit stronger in a controlled lab setting than in the more complex environment of a museum, but it was still there.
It seems that this feeling of connection to the artist, that this object was touched by them, that's a powerful factor in how much we value originals. And in a totally different area of research, Jarek Fingerhut and his colleagues found something really interesting. Changes in our own personal taste can actually influence how we see our own identity over time. If someone's aesthetic tastes change drastically, we might even see them as a somewhat different person than they were before. That's pretty profound, don't you think? It's like our aesthetic preferences are more deeply tied to our sense of self than we realize. Let's move on to something that's always a bit of a hot topic, and that's how we actually make aesthetic judgments. Is it all just subjective?
It definitely feels subjective sometimes, doesn't it? Whether our aesthetic judgments are truly objective or purely subjective has been a philosophical debate for centuries. When we say something is beautiful, are we saying something true about the world, or just expressing our personal preference? And closely related to that is the issue of aesthetic testimony. Can we actually learn anything about the beauty of something by listening to what other people say about it? We all know the saying, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, but influential philosophers like Hume and Kant didn't seem to think it was quite as simple as that.
You're right, they didn't. Hume, in his essay of the Standard of Taste, proposed this idea of a delicate taste. He was suggesting that some people, through practice and refinement, actually become better at recognizing what's truly aesthetically good. He also thought that works of art that stand the test of time and appeal to people across different cultures must have some kind of inherent quality. And Kant, in his Critique of Judgment, while admitting that judgments of beauty come from a feeling of pleasure, argued that they carry a kind of universality that we expect other people to agree with our judgments about beauty, unlike personal preferences like what food we like. It seems they both thought that judgments about beauty were more like factual claims than just personal opinions.
In a way, yes. And modern philosophers like Noel Carroll, Peter Lamarck, Robert Stecker, and Peter Kivy have pointed out that we actually do argue about aesthetics, which implies that there's something real to disagree about. Maybe there really is a right or wrong answer when it comes to beauty, or at least a way to be closer to the truth. But then comes experimental philosophy, which suggests that maybe our everyday understanding isn't actually aligned with that idea. Maybe people intuitively see aesthetic judgments as fundamentally subjective, a matter of personal taste.
Right. Jeffrey Goodwin and John Darley's research showed just that. They did studies where they showed people statements about art like, Shakespeare was a better writer than Dan Brown, and asked them if those statements were facts, opinions, or moral judgments. They found that people were more likely to call aesthetic judgments like that opinions, even when they strongly agreed with the statement. That's pretty interesting, isn't it? It suggests that we treat aesthetic disagreements differently than we treat disagreements about facts or morals.
For sure. And Florian Kove and his colleagues have explored this further. They gave people scenarios where two people had different aesthetic opinions, like one person finding a sunset amazing while another person wasn't impressed at all, and they asked if one of them was right, if they were both right in their own way, or if neither of them was objectively correct. And across many different objects and types of judgments, even across different cultures, the most common response was that neither person was objectively correct. It seems that when it comes to aesthetic disagreements, people tend to think it's a difference in subjective experience, rather than one person being right and the other wrong.
That seems to be the dominant intuition. And further research by Jennifer A. Rabb, Junkie Han, and Ellen Winner gave more evidence against the idea that people see aesthetic judgments as objective. Even when they were told that a work of art was historically acclaimed, or when they themselves really liked one artwork more than another, they still leaned towards seeing aesthetic judgments as subjective matters of personal taste. Of course, not everyone agrees with this, and some philosophers who support a more realist view have responded to these findings.
Yeah, there's definitely pushback. Zangwill, for example, argued that Kova studies might not actually be getting at whether people believe aesthetic judgments can be true or false in a deeper sense. He suggested that they're more about whether someone is justified in holding their view, rather than whether the view itself is objectively right or wrong. He argued that even if we acknowledge that people have different tastes, there might still be objective aesthetic truths out there. Kova and his team responded to this by doing another study that directly asked about truth in aesthetic disagreements, but their results still didn't quite line up with how we usually think about factual disagreements. So the debate is still going strong.
It's a fascinating debate, isn't it? And it seems like even if people say they believe in subjectivism when you ask them directly, they might still act as if there are shared standards or some kind of correctness when they actually talk about art.
See, exactly. Kitazi and his colleagues have suggested just that. They argue that the fact that people say beauty is subjective doesn't necessarily mean that they don't believe in some kind of shared standards when they're actually discussing and debating art. They think that Kova's results don't fully disprove a more implicit form of aesthetic realism. Kova himself has also offered a different perspective, saying that maybe people use aesthetic judgments primarily to express their feelings, but that doesn't mean they don't believe some feelings are more appropriate or justified than others. Like if you judge the beauty of a landscape when you're sober, that judgment is probably more valid than if you're judging it while under the influence of something. So our feelings might be subjective, but there might still be some agreement on when those feelings are based on something real.
Right. And James Andow's work adds more nuance to this. He suggests that even though people might not explicitly believe in objective aesthetic truths, they still think that aesthetic judgments should ideally meet certain standards. They think that there are conditions that make a judgment more or less correct, even though they don't think that disagreements automatically mean someone is wrong. And when you look at how we think about taste, research shows that most people do believe in a difference between good taste and bad taste, even though what they use to define those categories can vary a lot. Some people focus on objective qualities, and some just go with their personal preferences. So even if it all feels very subjective, we still operate with some idea of better and worse ways to experience and evaluate art. Now, what about things that influence our aesthetic judgments? Like, is it true that simply seeing something over and over again can make us like it more?
That's a really interesting question. It brings us to the mere exposure effect, which is this well-established psychological phenomenon where simply being repeatedly exposed to something tends to increase our liking for it. James Cutting looked at this in the context of art and found that people who were repeatedly exposed to Impressionist paintings, even without any explanation or analysis, ended up liking them more. This led some people to suggest that maybe our love for certain famous artworks is partly due to the fact that we see them everywhere, not because they're actually inherently better than other works. It kind of challenges the idea that if something has stood the test of time, it must be truly good.
Right, it makes you wonder. But Meskin and his colleagues came up with a counterargument. They suggested that maybe the mere exposure effect actually helps us appreciate both the good and the bad qualities of a work of art over time. They found that being repeatedly exposed to artworks that are generally considered high quality, like paintings by Millet, actually increased people's liking for them. On the flip side, repeatedly seeing works that are often seen as lower quality, like paintings by Kincaid, actually made people like them less. So maybe this test of time idea still holds some weight because it might amplify our natural responses to art, whether those responses are positive or negative.
Interesting. So repeated exposure doesn't just make us like everything more. It seems to highlight what we already find appealing or unappealing about a work.
That's the general idea. However, Ben Snadday pointed out some important things to keep in mind about the mere exposure effect, especially how relevant it really is to the question of whether aesthetic judgments are objective. He argued that this effect mainly deals with our immediate gut-level responses to things, not the more thoughtful and reasoned judgments we usually associate with aesthetic appreciation. He also noted that the effect is often specific to the exact artwork being shown, and it doesn't necessarily mean someone will start liking the entire style or movement. And finally, what about aesthetic testimony? How much should we rely on other people's opinions about art?
James Andow's research provides some insight here.
His studies found that we don't trust aesthetic opinions as much as we trust opinions about non-aesthetic things. Interestingly, this difference in trust wasn't really affected by whether people believed aesthetic judgments were objective or subjective. He also found that if we form a belief about art, or even about morality, based solely on what someone else tells us, we're less likely to see it as true knowledge compared to beliefs about factual things. Which is something to think about when you read reviews about art or take recommendations from friends. They might be helpful, but we probably feel like we need to experience the art ourselves to form our own judgment. Now let's talk about the specific language we use to discuss art. Aesthetic adjectives like beautiful, elegant, and so on.
Aesthetic adjectives are at the heart of how we talk about our experiences with art. Philosophers like Frank Sibley have argued that using these words correctly isn't just about identifying objective features, it takes a certain taste or sensitivity. Jason Sundell proposed that these words are special because they play a crucial role in how we establish and agree on shared standards for evaluating art. It's different from simply saying something is tasty or fun; those feel way more personal.
For sure. And while there's been a lot of research on what are called predicates of personal taste, like tasty or fun, aesthetic adjectives haven't really gotten as much attention. McNally and Stoyanovich argued that aesthetic adjectives are special because they express judgments without necessarily specifying who's making the judgment. They use the verb find as a test. Like, I find this soup tasty sounds normal because it's about a personal experience. But I find this building tall sounds weird because tall is an objective fact. This test helps researchers figure out if people treat aesthetic words more like opinions or more like objective descriptions. And in this test, aesthetic adjectives behave more like objective descriptions.
Exactly. Liao and Eskin took a different approach, looking at how the meaning of aesthetic adjectives changes depending on the context. They found that these words don't behave like typical adjectives, whether those that are absolute, like straight, or relative, like tall. Their findings suggested that these words have a special kind of context sensitivity where what they're being compared to isn't always clear from the situation. It's like those words have a hidden depth to them.
Totally. Stoyanovich questioned these findings a bit, suggesting that the patterns Liao and Meskin found weren't stable enough to draw strong conclusions. But more research by Liao, McNally, and Meskin, using huge databases of text, continued to show this weird behavior of aesthetic adjectives. This led them to propose that when we use a word like beautiful, the standard we're comparing it to might be something abstract or internal, not something in the immediate situation. So it's not just about comparing one thing to another that's right there in front of us.
That seems to be where the research is pointing. And even more recent work suggests that there might be important differences between different aesthetic adjectives, too. For example, Doran's upcoming research suggests that beautiful and pretty, while often used interchangeably, might actually function differently. He thinks that beauty, unlike pretty, is a dual character concept, meaning it has both descriptive and evaluative aspects, and its evaluative side is deeply connected to our values, including moral values. He points to the fact that phrases like true beauty sound right, while true prettiness sounds odd. This implies that beauty might have a deeper meaning that goes beyond just surface appearances, tying into our sense of right and wrong. And this brings us to another fascinating topic, the relationship between morality and aesthetics.
Morality and aesthetics are two major parts of our lives, and philosophers have always been curious about how they interact. Does knowing whether something is morally right or wrong affect whether we find it beautiful? And the other way around, does experiencing beauty affect our sense of morality? This idea of how values influence each other is a big topic of discussion. When it comes to morality's influence on aesthetics, there's this ongoing debate about ethical criticism of art. Some thinkers, called autonomists, believe that the moral content of art is irrelevant to its aesthetic value. Others, called moralists, argue that if a work of art depicts something morally wrong, it can never be truly beautiful. And then there are contextualists who think that the relationship between morality and aesthetics